Good morning, good evening, or good 2 in the morning, depending entirely on your time zone. I want to start with a parent, a teenager, and a family checkbook because it explains this story better than any map of the Middle East. Picture a household where, for 30 years, one kid gets a phone call before every major purchase the family makes. Not because he's paying for any of it, but because the family decided long ago they needed his blessing more than he needed theirs. Then, one Sunday, the parents quietly sell the house. The kid finds out scrolling his phone, like everybody else on the block. 3 days later, at dinner with the neighbors watching, Dad leans over and says, "You're the smallest contributor to this family, and without me, you wouldn't exist." That's the part of this week's story, already all over your feed, the public humiliation. I want to spend the next few minutes on the part almost nobody's covering, why a cautious father suddenly stopped caring what either of them thought of him. The real answer isn't sitting in Jerusalem. It's sitting in his own living room, in his own country. For 30 years, there was an unwritten rule in American foreign policy. Nothing major happens in the Middle East without Jerusalem hearing about it first, ideally before the cameras do. In 2015, a sitting Israeli prime minister flew to Washington and stood inside the United States Capitol to argue against a sitting American president's Iran policy to American lawmakers on American soil. No foreign leader had pulled that off before. This past week, Benjamin Netanyahu learned his own war with Iran had ended by watching television, days after being told at the G7 he was, in Trump's own words, the very small partner. Great headline. Treating it as the whole story, though, is like reviewing a car crash and only mentioning the dent. There's an engine failure underneath it, and it's American. Rewind to February 28th. The U.S. and Israel launched a joint operation against Iran under a name pulled from a movie trailer, Operation Epic Fury. Within hours, Iran's supreme leader was dead, and Americans were told this would take weeks. It took 4 months. By the time a ceasefire framework got signed this past week, at least 13 American service members were dead. The Pentagon had burned through close to $30 billion and was asking Congress for $200 billion more, which is partly why one armored corps in Texas had its training budget cut by nearly $300 million mid-war. Gas prices climbed high enough that by May, 64% of Americans said it was hurting their household budget, and 86% blamed the war directly. Nearly every week of this conflict, a majority of the country told pollster after pollster the same 3 things. They opposed it, they thought the president was handling it badly, and they didn't think it was making the country safer. By June, his overall approval had slid to 35%, with barely 3 in 10 approving his Iran strategy. None of that sounds like a president negotiating from strength. It sounds like a man trying to get off a sinking ship before the cameras notice he's swimming. Here's the detail the Israel framing always skips. Congress noticed first. The 1973 War Powers Act gives a president 60 days of unauthorized combat before Congress has to weigh in. Epic Fury blew past that months earlier. In early June, the Republican House did something it had refused to do 3 times already this year, passing a resolution, 215 to 208, directing the president to wind the war down. 4 Republicans crossed over. One of them, Kentucky's Thomas Massie, put it plainly, saying people were tired of $5 gallon gas and $6 gallon diesel. It was the first time either chamber managed to pass anything telling this president to stop, and it changed nothing. The administration argued the legal clock had reset, and the war continued for 2 more weeks until the president decided, on his own schedule, that it was over. Sit with that, because it's the real headline hiding under this week's headline. The institution the Constitution hands war powers to also didn't get a phone call it could do anything with. So, when the deal landed on Sunday the 14th, and Netanyahu learned his own war had ended from a television screen, and his government spent days asking, through NBC News, simply to be shown the document, this wasn't really about Israel losing a special relationship. It was the second group in 4 months to learn this White House negotiates with exactly one stakeholder, itself. Congress got outrun by its own deadline. Israel got outrun by a camera crew. When the president told the G7 that Netanyahu was the very small partner, and Israel wouldn't exist without him, he wasn't only managing an ally. He was performing toughness for an audience that had spent 4 months watching gas prices climb and watching service members come home in caskets. An audience that badly needed to see somebody get talked down to for a change. His vice president did the rest 2 days later. Asked about Israel's reaction, J.D. Vance said he found the whole freakout a little odd, and suggested the country can't fight its way out of every problem it has. Conservative voices who'd spent a decade treating any daylight between Washington and Jerusalem as a scandal went quiet, or, in Newt Gingrich's case, publicly annoyed, which tells you something. This isn't a White House drifting from Israel out of ideology. It's a White House discovering the loudest part of its own coalition isn't the hawks who've run Republican foreign policy since Reagan. It's the gas price, no more forever wars wing that just passed a war powers resolution against a president of their own party. Vance wasn't talking to Jerusalem, he was talking to them. 3 groups didn't get a phone call this spring, and Israel is the least interesting one. Congress was the second. Here's the third, and it should bother you most. A lot of the president's own Senate allies didn't see the deal's text either until roughly the week the rest of us did. Ted Cruz called, sending Iran billions of dollars, an exceptionally bad idea. Bill Cassidy, freshly humiliated in his own primary, called the outcome the worst foreign policy blunder in decades. And because the administration had promised mediators it wouldn't publish the text before signing, officials reportedly got around their own promise by reading it aloud, line by line, on a press call, a remarkable way to handle the most consequential Iran agreement since 2015. Negotiated not by nuclear physicists over 2 years like the original, but largely by a real estate developer and the president's own son-in-law, with reporters transcribing a treaty by ear like a recipe nobody's allowed to write down. Strip away the Jerusalem subplot, and what you're watching is a president who, inside one 4-month war, outran a war powers deadline his own party wrote 50 years ago, ignored a House resolution against him, kept his own Senate hawks in the dark until showtime, and only then let his closest Middle East ally find out on television with everyone else. The Israel story has the better headline. The American story has the bigger implications, because it answers a question voters have quietly asked since at least the first Iraq War. When a president decides this country goes to war, and decides when it stops, does anything, an ally, a law, his own coalition, get a vote? For 4 months running, the answer kept coming back the same way. Not really, just him. The strongest version of the other side deserves a hearing too. Maybe ending this war on his own terms is exactly what democratic accountability looks like in practice. Americans, for 4 straight months, told every pollster they wanted it over, and didn't think it was making anyone safer. A president who ends an unpopular war his own voters wanted finished isn't trampling the system. He's responding to it, even if the rollout was a mess. And the senators worried about the Reconstruction Fund and Iran's surviving missile program have a real point. Tom Cotton put the oil revenue now flowing back to Tehran at somewhere between $150 and $200 million a day. We ended an unpopular war, and we ended it on terms that strengthen the regime we just spent 4 months fighting can both be true at once. You're allowed to think the war needed to end, and that this ending should worry you. What's genuinely impressive, in a way you almost have to admire from a safe distance, is how efficiently one war taught the same lesson to 3 completely different audiences. Israel learned the closest ally doesn't get a phone call. Congress learned a war powers vote can pass and change nothing. Senate Republicans learned that being in the president's own party doesn't get you the document before the cameras do. 3 oversight mechanisms, 1 outcome each time. You really do have to give credit where it's due. That's not chaos. That's consistency. I'm Marcus Fenn. This is Borderlines. We're just getting started, and if a war nobody in Washington fully controlled is the kind of story you want more of, you already know where the subscribe button is. 1 flag before you record. This story is still moving fast. Deal text, casualty counts, approval numbers could shift week to week. So it's worth a quick spot check on the latest figures before publishing.